This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. If you like what you hear, please consider rating and reviewing the podcast in the Apple Podcast Store. That makes the podcast more visible to more people. On to today's show. This is another episode in the ongoing series of mental health professionals who specialize in religious trauma, religious abuse, and the emerging term adverse religious experiences. My guest today is Brian Peck. Brian is a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in religious-based trauma in his private practice and guides individuals through their deconversions with evidence-based practices online. He is the founder of Room to Thrive, secular therapy for human well-being. And he asked the question, what does your nervous system need to thrive after religious trauma? In my conversation with Brian, I refer to an episode of the Life After God podcast with Brian, Carolyn Golden, and James Connolly. I do highly recommend that you take a listen to that if you have gone through or are in the process of deconversion. I will have the links in my show notes to that podcast episode. As you're about to hear, Brian has had a tremendous amount of influence on me personally, and in our conversation, you're going to hear me learning in real time. This is kind of the value that Brian brings to the conversation about deconversion, religious trauma, a trauma-informed lens, and religious abuse. So now I give you Brian Peck. Brian Peck, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thanks so much. It's really great to be here this morning.
Brian, it's just fantastic to have you on. I think you know that you've had a fair amount of influence on me and what I'm trying to accomplish here. I consider you one of the experts in the field, and what I'm doing is just some guy on the internet, whereas you actually know what you're talking about. So I'm very glad you're here to explain things to us.
Well, I certainly don't want you to underestimate what you do bring to the table, for sure. And I think sometimes we defer to the experts when we realize we don't understand that we actually have a lot to offer ourselves. And so I certainly don't want you to shortchange yourself and what you actually bring to this conversation. I've really appreciated your tone in what you're doing as well. I know the Graceful Atheist, is an interesting phrase or kind of title. And I think it's really great to kind of point out, we can bring a bit of grace, a bit of kind of compassion in understanding to this process. So I certainly appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much. I do appreciate that. Just a quick personal story. I think you and I had a conversation. You were kind enough to give me an hour on the phone about a year and a half ago. And I don't know if you recall, but at the time I was like, let me do something. Help me, let me join, let me do something. I had no idea what I could do in this community. Mm-hmm. And I found that the podcast is just ideal for me. And I do it often for selfish reasons because I get to talk to people like yourself.
Sure.
But I feel like some people are at least getting something out of it.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think having those conversations is really important. And I hope that by kind of infusing some of this trauma-informed approach or these conversations with therapists as well, that it's maybe kind of informing those personal stories as well, so that it's not just a recounting of abuse or what's happened to me or my personal experience, but also kind of what can I do to move forward from here. And that's really why I got involved in this work, kind of from my own personal past and experience, as well as just seeing people get stuck in their story.
Right.
We often, as humans, are really enamored with language, and so it's easy to kind of live inside of a story or a narrative that no longer works for us. And it's hard to kind of shift that, even if we change beliefs, mm-hmm. Kind of set aside old beliefs that no longer worked for us. It's challenging to develop a new way of thinking or support your nervous system enough that you feel safe thinking new thoughts and having new experiences. And so, it's really exciting to see how both of our work can kind of really enhance each other. So
appreciate it. Yeah. And we'll get into the details in just a moment, but I think the thing that we're aligned on the most is that the whole human being is involved, mm-hmm. that deconversion is an emotional and what I call quote unquote spiritual, but just that the whole person is involved. not just the rational thinking part of the person.
Yeah, you know, I think that gets missed oftentimes because we can focus on the harmful beliefs and we can point out how they have impacted people in this adverse way. But then we think, well, the goal then is just to undermine those beliefs, change those beliefs, and that's part of the work for sure. But if this is purely a cognitive process, people will have completely new beliefs and done that kind of intellectual process of the deconversion, but feel a bit stuck, a bit, what do I do from here? And I think bringing the whole person to the conversation, how do we support these various kind of parts of being human?
Right.
I think that's just so important, and that's often missed. And it is, in some ways, it's more comfortable to just stay in this "let me tell you a story" place, or here are why these beliefs are wrong place. And I think it's actually quite common working with trauma survivors to have them recount horrific events that they personally have experienced from this very kind of reading the news type of almost a distance to that experience. And I think in some ways that's the trap of language, the trap of our narrative, our story, is if we're not able to kind of connect to that at this deeper level and then integrate it in a way that we can be healthy and move forward, it just becomes this thing that we carry with us that, you know, continues to be challenging or difficult for us as humans, but we never kind of work through it. And I think that's what's often missed when we just look at this process through that kind of cognitive lens.
Right. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's also a sense in which we have an experience. There's a lot of emotion involved. There may be trauma involved, and we tell ourselves a post hoc rationalization of what that means.
Yeah. I think that's a really great way of looking at that. And we kind of know this from cognitive science that we humans have this perception that we're more in control than we actually are of
Right.
what's going on in our experience. And I think maybe now is a good time just to kind of point out that we can know things on a cognitive level. And that's incredibly important. There's so many domains in the human experience where knowing something cognitively, writing it down, you know, getting on paper, hashing it out, changing our mind, looking at different ways, like the ability of language to kind of really get to some deeper truths is like so important, right? So
Right.
When I talk about these different domains, I'm not saying the cognitive process isn't helpful, right? It certainly is.
Right.
It's, you know, where science and philosophy and these different experiences that we humans have that really enhance what it means to be human. But then if we forget that we also know things kind of emotionally, right? We know things at this emotional intelligence kind of domain. And it's tempting to dismiss that and to be like, oh, well, that's just someone's being emotional. I mean, we even say that, like, well, you're just being emotional. Well, let's be rational and like cold and logical, and let's just facts only, please. You know, like we can take that approach. But we're primarily emotional creatures, right? And then we tell ourselves a story about that, kind of like you said, post hoc, where we can make sense of that in a way that we appear to be rational and reasonable humans. And we bring our kind of past to each moment. We bring our biases, we bring, you know, all this kind of internal stuff, and then we perceive our experience as if we're being completely rational, and often we miss out on a lot of really important information. And then also kind of even one level deeper than knowing things emotionally is knowing things somatically or physically, like the felt sense experience. And when we realize that we humans, because we evolved to survive that's like the most important thing for our body is to survive. So we're constantly assessing for threat in our environment. And that's happening in this kind of subconscious, we call it neuroception. It's this sense of my body is detecting and kind of communicating with itself about the state of, am I safe or not in the world? What do I need to do to respond to a perceived or a real threat? And so when we start to realize that we are experiencing the world first through our sensations, and then we're forced to kind of make sense of that cognitively. And an example of that is, you know, judges that are tasked with awarding parole to prisoners. They've done the studies, and the hour or two before lunch, people don't get parole as often, because if the judge is feeling hungry, the perception is that the parolee isn't ready to, they don't appear trustworthy. So
Right.
like the felt sense that we're experiencing, we will tell ourselves a story that is consistent and coherent because we need to make sense of the world. If I'm feeling on edge for some reason and I meet a new person, I'm going to perceive them with a little bit of distance. They're not quite as trustworthy. I might have a bit of fear around this person because of my felt sense. And the story I tell myself is that there's something wrong with them, right?
Right.
And there may or may not be, right?
Yes.
but the reality is that we're making sense of the world from this kind of storytelling cognitive place. But if we can tune into like the felt sense of being human and start to notice that when my body is experiencing different sensations, that's important information for us, important data. Now I can start to behave sooner to threat. I can start detecting it further out from my body,
Right.
and I can start to do something about it earlier. And so I think that's what often we're missing, that piece where we, like I said, we get really caught up in language in the story.
Yeah.
We're clever apes in that way, where we really kind of,
Right.
think that the story is the important piece. But it's really, I'm finding it's really, really essential to tune into this part of our humanity, this mammalian kind of nervous system that gives us so much information if we're just able to listen.
Right. So we're going to get to the religious trauma and the religious abuse side of things, but something that you just said really struck me about being in the bubble of faith as well, like why it is so difficult to come to a deconstruction moment, a deconversion moment, is that our bodies, our minds are perceiving the truth as threat.
Yes.
All of what you've said also applies to what holds us back from recognizing the truth.
Yeah, I think in some ways that's what kind of religious fundamentalism and this kind of more extreme version of, logic and reason and just the rational way of processing the world. Within fundamentalism, we're taught to, not trust your emotions, not trust your body. And it's really focused on the beliefs, right? Like the story is the most important piece. So much so that there's really no distinction or difference between our beliefs and who we are as humans, right? That's what we're told.
Right.
And so when our body's perceiving that something isn't right or isn't safe for us, we're told to question that and just trust the beliefs. And I think to a different degree, on this kind of atheist perspective, we're also kind of taught to not trust our emotions, to, like if the beliefs are the bad things, we need to correct them, and we correct the beliefs, then we're going to feel safe and okay. But the reality is that if our body doesn't feel safe and okay, we can tell ourselves as much as we want that, you're okay, there's no hell, there's no eternal damnation, whatever the fear might be, the story might be. We can tell ourselves it's not true.
Right.
But I work with, countless survivors of religious trauma, and they almost always will say that fear persists even though they no longer believe that. And that's because that's a felt sense. They experience at some point in their life, probably often in early childhood, they experience their nervous system being overwhelmed by fear and not having the ability to escape to safety or to defend themselves effectively. And that's a recipe for trauma. Like trauma exists in this kind of, I needed to do something to protect myself, but was prohibited from doing that or wasn't allowed to do that. Didn't have the resources. I was a child. I didn't have the autonomy to do that.
Right.
And then the nervous system, if it's not able to escape to safety, will kind of go into this freeze collapse or this please appease kind of physiological state. And even if you move past that, if you don't let your body know in some way that it's safe again, no amount of telling yourself that you're safe is going to change that.
Right.
If you've ever told someone not to feel anxious because there's nothing to be worried about, you realize like how pointless that is.
Right.
And yet the interesting thing is, so much of the approach to religious trauma, especially from this kind of cognitive place, is doing that. It's almost like, victim shaming in some way. Like, you shouldn't feel this way because you no longer believe this. Right. And if we're not addressing a person from this trauma-informed place of the needs of their nervous system, we're not going to shift and change that. We might make some small impacts over time, but if we notice why those shifts and changes are happening, even from a cognitive kind of focus, it's because their body's starting to feel safe and okay again. And so we can really speed up that process in terms of healing trauma by focusing on where trauma lives in the body, as opposed to the cognitive story we tell ourselves post hoc.
Very interesting. We could go a number of ways with that. What I want to get to, though, immediately is we've introduced the concept of religious trauma. Let's kind of define our terms a little bit. We've had Laura Anderson on, probably in the episode prior to this one, talk about the difference between those two. I'd like to hear you
Sure.
talk about that.
Yeah.
And how that comes into play in your practice.
Yeah, sure. And I think that distinction between abuse, religious abuse or religious harm, and religious trauma, it's really important distinction. Of course, all of these ideas are going to be more complex than we can cover in this interview.
Sure.
And so I just want to put that out there, and I'll describe them in kind of simple terms now, with the understanding that it's more complicated than that. So in the very simplest way of understanding that, abuse is kind of what happens to you.
Mm-hmm.
You know, abuse is the person berating you. Abuse is the doctrine that's harming you. Abuse is the physical, someone's, hitting you, right? We could say that's abuse.
Right.
And for some nervous systems, that will result in like just a rough time, and they'll get through that and things will be fine and okay. If that nervous system has enough resources to withstand that, if there's enough resilience built into the system, they can withstand that.
Okay.
That's the difference between, the same kind of abuse happening to a child versus an adult. Oftentimes the child, because they have less resources, that's going to impact them more. Not always. And sometimes the adult can have less resources. And so we want to really focus on the mismatch between the demand placed on the nervous system and the resources the nervous system has to kind of survive.
Can I tell a quick personal story? I don't know how much of my story you know. Somebody online just recently brought up the concept of ACEs, the
yes, sure.
adverse child.
Yep, sure.
Yeah, exactly. And so it just so happens that I have a relatively high number of those. Yeah. There was a lot of substance abuse in my family. What you've talked about there is really important, this idea of resilience. So I can recognize lots of the emotional abuse in my case and the neglect and those kinds of things that have been destructive for lots of people who have gone through that. And for reasons that I can't explain, I had enough people in my life who loved me. I had the right community or whatever, or the right personality, that I've suffered few of the many possible repercussions that are tied to ACEs. So in a similar way, what we're saying here is that someone who experiences religious trauma, one person might be more resilient and not have the same level of suffering, let's say, versus someone who, for whatever reasons, they don't have that resiliency, or the abuse is overwhelming in some way that diminishes that they're going to experience the after effects much, much worse. Is that?
Yeah. And so exactly. And I'm glad you made that point, because I think when we look at the ACEs studies, we also want to be looking at the protective factors, right? We know that if a child experiences a lot of adverse experiences, but they have one caring, well-attuned adult in their life, a teacher,
a grandma,
friend, grandma, whoever it is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like that resource for that nervous system, we just can't kind of capture how important that is, right? That's so essential. And so you're right. It is this combination of the adverse experiences plus the resources that nervous system has. And when we recognize that just one caring adult in a child's life can be the difference between experiencing abuse or developing trauma, right?
Right.
And so, and I think that's also important to notice that, I think it's important to point this out right now, that we're not talking about any kind of moral failing or, the person should have tried harder, or because often shame is associated with trauma because we have this sense or this feeling that, well, I should have been able to escape, right? I want everyone listening to understand that if you have survived trauma of any sort, your nervous system did exactly what it needed to do to survive.
Right.
And it did that without your consent. It did that because it's part of this autonomic nervous system. It's doing this kind of because your body evolved to survive. And so your body will kind of go into this fight or flight mode without your permission. And if you're not able to escape to safety, it'll go into a freeze collapse mode as this kind of survival strategy. And if you've survived trauma of any kind, we can assume with a great deal of certainty that your nervous system did what was required to survive.
Yeah.
That being so I don't want anyone to take on any shame for what their nervous system did to survive. Why did I
Right.
comply with that pastor? Why did I say go along with this harmful message that I was taught? If we look at that person's experience in that context, their nervous system was doing what was necessary to survive, almost without fail.
Right.
And when you have additional resources in the future, and you can heal from that by, resourcing your nervous system, having the support and resilience that you need, then you can shift and change how you physically feel in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But again, we want to take the shame out of it for sure.
Absolutely. And again, to just try to be personal for a second, this is a conversation that my wife and I have probably every couple of months, where I talk about, my inability sometimes to connect. Sometimes I shut down because, I need to be protective of myself. And I try to be as aware as possible. And, my wife is wonderful and works with me on that as well. But I want to make clear that the after effects of the trauma, I didn't want to say that they don't exist.
Sure, of course. Yeah.
I'm saying I've missed some of the deadliest of them.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
But definitely the after effects are there.
Yeah.
And so the key thing that you have just said that I want listeners to hear is there is no shame in your body, your mind, your emotions response to trauma.
Right. Yeah. And I think that level of insight that you just, described with your own experience, you can oftentimes trauma replaces protection, this need for connection with protection, right? Mm-hmm. So we humans evolved to connect. We when we were born, we need community to survive. And that kind of co-regulating that happens when two nervous systems support each other. So the infant, when it's born for the first 6 months, is still developing its nervous system so that it can have the ability to regulate. Mm-hmm. If it doesn't have during those critical first 6 months, but then also throughout childhood and throughout entire life, but the earlier on is more important. If that child doesn't have the necessary resources to kind of fully develop and feel safe in the world and connected, they will live the rest of their life with this kind of underlying sense that the world is just not safe. I can't let my guard down. I'm on edge. And so when you notice that, if you've experienced trauma and survived that, then you notice that sometimes your physical body is in this place of I don't feel safe and okay. And then you can start to, the more aware you are of that and the sensations that are connected to that, then you can start to do things in the service of providing safety for yourself by connecting with others. And so there's ways of kind of moving from these kind of shut down or fight or flight physiological states to this kind of safe and social physiological state that we want to live inside of. But also, as humans, if we could design the perfect human, which I think yes. Evolution has done a fairly decent job, we would want a human to feel safe and okay and connected.
Yeah.
And then as soon as a threat arose in their environment, they would respond quickly and forcefully to the threat, and they would neutralize that. And then they would come back to safe and social.
Right.
Or if they were unable to neutralize that because the threat overpowered them in some way, or the threat persisted over time, as in a case of a lot of religious trauma or complex trauma, then that nervous system would shut down in a way to survive. And once the threat was no longer present, then they would be able to come back into an activated state of fight or flight. They would do what was necessary to regain a sense of control and power in their life. And then they would move up into safe and social. And so as I think about that, that's how I think I would design humans.
Yes.
And as it turns out, that's how evolution has designed humans. And so, using the term designed loosely,
right,
we need to survive. That's so important to us. And so these systems that developed early on in our evolutionary past really serve the need of survival. And then we have evolved to feel safe and social as well. And that's been so important for human connection, and it allows humans to develop in groups and connect with each other. But those underlying or those kind of more primitive parts of our nervous system are also at play all the time, and we can't turn those off. Right. And I think it's important to look at religious trauma through that lens of what our body needs to feel safe and okay, because it simply isn't enough to just try to shift and change the story of that. It just doesn't help us feel safe again.
So I understand the current, I don't know, if theory is the right way to describe it, or the way that people are describing this is religious trauma syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
And if I understand correctly, you have a slightly different take on that, and I'd like to hear the details of that.
Yeah, sure. So I think religious trauma syndrome, from what I understand, it was an idea that Marlene Winnell came up with, I think back in the 80s. And it was a way to point out that religion can be harmful to some people. And I think it's a really important thing to point out. I think it's necessary. I think that at that time and even now, there's still this kind of viewing religion and spirituality through this strength-based perspective, which it is for some folks, but it's not for everyone. And so I think it was a pretty big shift to say religion can also be harmful.
Right.
What she did primarily was to look at current diagnoses and then also kind of connect like, within religion, particularly within fundamentalism, there's a lot of connection between PTSD, a lot of connection between depression, anxiety, and we can see how people who have experienced abuse inside of religion have these responses that we would expect. So I think that's really the value of religious trauma syndrome as a way of saying, hey, religion can be harmful.
Okay.
I think where it doesn't, and I think it's an important first step. And so let me be very clear. I value the awareness it's brought to the conversation and the advocacy. We need to do something about this.
Right.
I think, however, it's primarily come to be about understanding religious abuse. As we spoke earlier, the difference between abuse and trauma is an important distinction. So when we talk about religious trauma syndrome, we're often just at that stage of abuse has happened. We're noticing abuse and it has impacts on humans. And I think that's an important, very, very important first step.
Right.
If that's all we're doing is pointing that out and, describing stories of abuse, we risk kind of re-traumatizing survivors if that's all we're doing. And I know there's been, some effort to do some retreats and talk to individuals and kind of shift their story. And it's been very cognitively focused. Like I said, has some value, but isn't always very effective when it comes to treating trauma. And so my thought with religious trauma syndrome is that it doesn't go far enough to start addressing trauma.
Okay.
And if we were to shift to a more trauma-informed perspective, we would recognize that religion can be harmful. It can also be helpful for some folks. And I think that's, maybe on the Graceful Atheist podcast, that's maybe...
That's not controversial to say.
Okay. Not in this context, but I think in some atheist context, it would be controversial.
And I can fall into this trap at times, but the hard atheist side of all religion is bad and it needs to be wiped from the face of the earth is unrealistic to begin with and counterproductive.
Sure.
I want to speak up for truth, and all of that is very important to me, but there is a part of being a human being that is, if you want to put it in negative terms, susceptible to religion. And that is likely not going away anytime soon. And so it's important that we embrace people, the whole person. And I think maybe we'll chat about this in a little bit, but in particular, the people in our lives who are still believers, that we not see them as dumb, that we not see them as, fooled or something like that. We need to appreciate that as a part of humanity, and we can recognize the bad parts about it and call those out and still recognize the full human being. So
I'm really glad you're pointing it out. And I think that's where the risk we run is if we make religion is the problem, then oftentimes folks will leave religion assuming that their trauma is going to resolve, that they're going to be safer and better and okay in the world. And that's just simply not how trauma works. You have to do that healing work of giving your nervous system the resources to feel safe and okay again. And so I think that's when we start focusing on abuse as the problem, which it clearly is a problem. I want to be very, very, very clear, but abuse does not equal trauma. And trauma is a different kind of problem than abuse. And so when people leave religion thinking that, okay, now I've escaped and I'm safe now, that will likely prevent them from developing future trauma. And I think that's a worthwhile cause if we want to, look at reducing, sexual abuse in the world, we're going to do things like talk about rape culture. We'll talk about, why systems are failing
Right.
the vulnerable, why this power and control is resulting in people being abused and exploited. And that these are societal, systemic, as well as individual issues that we need to address. Super, super important. So I don't want anyone to get the impression that I don't care about abuse. I care deeply about abuse.
Right.
Because
Absolutely.
abuse often results in trauma. However, if a person has experienced trauma, that's going to require a different skill set than bringing awareness to abuse. Bringing awareness to abuse for a trauma survivor is not going to be helpful often.
Okay.
And in fact, it can be counterproductive.
Interesting.
And so I think that's where religious trauma syndrome has the impression that it's focused on trauma, because trauma is included in the word, in the term religious trauma syndrome.
Yeah.
But it really is focused primarily on abuse and really hasn't focused very much at all on trauma. And that's beginning to shift. I don't know that it's going to shift within inside the religious trauma syndrome construct. But there is a growing number of clinicians who work with religious trauma who are bringing this kind of trauma-informed approach to the conversation. And I think ideally, religious trauma syndrome could continue to focus on the abuse piece and that kind of, creating awareness, advocating for people who have been abused, and hopefully also challenging religious organizations to do something about it, to change how they're structured and how they treat their members.
Right.
But then there needs to be this other kind of focus on, if you have experienced trauma, you need a different set of resources available that really focus on the trauma piece.
Okay. Is it unfair or too simplistic to say that recognizing the abuse is step one of many?
I think it's fair. I think that's also, and again, I think that it was important for Marlene Winnell to point that out, that it's quite common for folks who have experienced trauma to not recognize it, to be like, oh, well, that's just how it was when I was a kid,
Yeah.
That's just how my folks were. That's how it was. And they don't realize that kind of always cringing in life or bracing for the next, hit.
Right.
That's not an ideal default setting for your nervous system. In fact, that takes a massive toll on your nervous system. That's why the adverse childhood experiences are often associated with, a lot of kind of physical health issues.
Right.
Because a nervous system that's under that demand all the time, it's just not sustainable. It will take a toll on the person. And so I think kind of recognizing that is important. And then once you recognize, oh yeah, like I did experience abuse, my nervous system is indicating to me that it was in fact trauma because of how I exist in the world today. Now that's a place to say, okay, what do I do about trauma? And that's when working with a licensed clinician who understands trauma can be really, really important. Or at least talking about your experience through this trauma-informed lens, through the lens of the nervous system. I think those are going to be a lot more meaningful and helpful conversations to have versus either being dismissive of it, it wasn't a big of a deal, or it was a big deal, but all I'm focused on is that religion is bad. Because that's not going to help you heal.
Right.
It's worth pointing out. And I think, like you said, it can be a very important first step. But if a person has experienced trauma, there are a lot more steps to take.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, Brian, if you have a little more time, I did want to talk about an episode of Life After God that you did with two of your colleagues. And I believe it was titled How and Why We Believe with Carolyn Golden and James Connolly.
Yeah.
And no joke, if you're listening to this podcast now, pause it and go find this in the archives of the Life After God podcast. It is absolutely worth your time. It's Brian Peck and his two colleagues, and it's just as experts talking about the deconversion process from the psychology perspective. And I wanted to bring up just a couple of terms that I believe it was Carolyn brought up that I use to this day. And the first of which is this idea of attribution. And why I think that's important is there's a tendency, and to again refer back to the atheist community, can be so focused on just the rationality that there's a negative perspective on people who have had any sense of faith in the past at all. And what Carolyn is pointing out is that it's an attribution error. The person having the religious experience is having something is real is happening. They're experiencing awe. They're experiencing something in their body even. And yet they are attributing this to an external entity,
Mm-hmm.
in this case, God. And I just think it's a beautiful way of delineating what is actually mistaken there.
Yeah.
How do you understand that? And anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. So I think it's really great. And I certainly, both Carolyn and James have been colleagues for a while. And actually, we're both of them were clinical supervisors for me at one point
Okay.
in my career. And so I just have massive amounts of respect for them. And Carolyn is just a brilliant clinician and human. And so I wish she were here to give you more insight into that.
Well, maybe you'll have to provide an introduction, and I'll have.
Yeah,
her.
I would love to. Yeah, she's really great, and she's former Catholic as well, so that's kind of her background. So I think what's important, and it kind of ties back to what we're talking about with understanding the world through a sensation as well.
Mm-hmm.
We have an experience as humans that feels transcendent. It's ineffable. We don't understand it. And there can be lots of reasons why that happens. And we can also kind of think about the evolutionary reasons why awe is an important kind of human experience. Kind of on the other side, there's like disgust is also a really, really important human experience. And then once we have an experience of awe or even disgust, we attribute that to something. Mm-hmm. And I think, I guess I'm almost of the opinion that we always get that wrong.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's easy for us to point out like how religious folks get that wrong.
Yes.
Oh, well, they're attributing this to this kind of being that's out there somewhere, eternal, supernatural, whatever. But I think even if we kind of attribute it to this kind of naturalistic thing, well, there's these kind of neurons firing in a certain way based upon the input coming in through your eyes and whatever. Like we no matter how we attribute that, we're going to miss stuff. It's not going to be correct. And so I think this is just an inherent human kind of dilemma. Like, how do we kind of understand and organize things? Because as soon as we write it down, as soon as we speak it, as soon as we think we understand it, we're trying to kind of put it into a box or a category in such a way that it doesn't actually fit in that box or that category.
Right.
And so I think that's in some ways you could see that as being really frustrating of like, well, I need to know exactly what's going on here. But it feels like you could always zoom in more. Mm-hmm. I think that's what we're learning through science is like, we can zoom in like, oh, okay, we understand at this level. And it's like, oh, but you can zoom in even further.
Right.
And we can zoom out. And then we can zoom out even more. And I think that's where, for me at least, it produces this massive amount of humility. Like, I can't pretend that I know things anymore as much as I would love to. And so I think that's just that sense of we will be making these attribution errors all the time.
Yeah.
And that's just part of the human condition. And so to not hold tightly to beliefs or ideas, which are human attempts to kind of put things in boxes. And so I think Carolyn in an episode talked about if we have this kind of God box, this God category, then we have experiences and we're just like, oh, that's God, that's God, that's God,
Right. I think that was actually the second term that her idea was the idea of schema.
Yeah, sure.
That we tend to, when we experience something or we learn something, we then tie it to an idea that we already have. Mm-hmm. That she used the analogy of boxes. So when we experience awe, we put it in the God box.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, again, from an evolutionary perspective, that's a really great strategy for a system that has limited resources to have an experience of awe and to zoom in far enough to like understand it at the very kind of minute level, or zoom out far enough to understand it in this kind of bigger context. You could spend a lifetime trying to figure that out, like one moment of awe, and then all of a sudden, like your quest for your life is laid out for you. You need to figure this out. Or you could do the evolutionarily adaptive thing and be like, oh, that's God, or that's something.
Yes.
And then you just kind of keep moving on because, it just makes sense that we have this kind of shorthand, kind of from an evolutionary standpoint.
I think one of the most important things that you said in discussing this is that it is a human foible, and it doesn't go away when we reject religion. The lesson that I learned from deconversion that I don't necessarily see everyone derive is humility, is epistemic humility, is my ignorance is deep and profound. And
Yeah.
going back to the post hoc rationalizations, that ties into this idea of attribution.
Mhm.
I do the same thing. I'm very much on the lookout of when I describe my deconversion experience, I know that I'm embellishing.
Yeah.
I am changing my memory of the events that led up to it. So the story that I tell today, I know isn't reality.
Sure. Yeah.
And I know that I'm committing attribution errors
Sure.
through that entire process. So I just to point out that we're humans, that continues. It isn't just a religious person.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's actually two things I want to say in response to that, because I think you bring up a really great point. And back to that kind of idea of categories or boxes or schemas, right? So, and then this will be useful to connect with believing family members and
Yes.
friends.
Yeah.
When we leave the faith, our believing friends and family had a box for us. They knew that we were believers. They understood us. And then all of a sudden we've asked them to not view us in that box anymore. And in fact, now we're this new person that they're trying to figure out, and they don't have a sense of what to do with us. However, in most belief systems, they do have a box for us, the
Right.
apostate, the non-believer, the angry at God, the whatever, immoral, just wanting to sin kind of box, right? And
Right.
so they're going to put us in that instinctively, naturally, because that's the easy box to put us in, even though it feels uncomfortable. And at some point, they'll realize, like, well, but David's still a compassionate human. Like, now what do I do? He's not this kind of monster that we thought he was going to be.
Yes.
And so then that challenges that box, and it makes it really difficult for folks to know what to do with us. And I think oftentimes there's this void of, like, I don't know how to view you anymore. And if we as former believers just let our friends and family struggle with that on their own, they will come up with a box, and that makes sense to them. And that's how they'll see us. We can, in some relationships at least, not everyone, but in some relationships, we can say, hey, you know what? I know this is hard for you. Here's what I want to do for you. I want to offer you a way of thinking about me. I'm still a compassionate person. These are my core values. These are things I care deeply about. This is the kind of person I want to be in the world.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, you've given them at least the option. It's still going to create some dissonance between their beliefs, right? But you've given them an option of, like, hey, here's a box that I could use to kind of view Brian through, or David through, or whoever through.
Right.
Giving them at least that structure that they could use some or all of can be just so helpful, because honestly, their brain is trying to figure out where to put us. And so, and I think this is where, when you were kind of being humble at the beginning of the podcast, and like, well, I'm not a professional. This podcast is a way to contribute in some way. I think what you're doing is you're allowing people to create new schemas, new boxes, new categories. And if believing friends and family stumble across your podcast and hear people's stories, it really does change how they start to perceive non-believers.
Right.
If they can realize, like, oh, well, they're just like me. They, there's anxiety and struggle, and there's questions, and all of a sudden you're helping to create a new way of looking at this experience. And I think that can be super powerful in undermining these kind of caricatures and stereotypes.
Well, thank you again. I do appreciate that. What I try to focus on with the podcast is the human story.
Sure.
Yes. It isn't just that I changed my beliefs, but this is what I experienced as a human being. And people have been incredibly generous to be vulnerable, to tell their stories in a level of honesty that surprises me every time I have somebody on the podcast. So in that sense, I'm glad to fulfill that role.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that other piece too, when it comes back to these categories and attribution error, we also, it is a really common experience to go from a very kind of strict fundamentalist religious background, and then losing all of that certainty in a short amount of time as it kind of crumbles underneath your feet, for your brain to still be like, I super need certainty in my life. And then to, like, swing to the other extreme sometimes of, like, I need to know for sure, and I need to know why and how. And I think sometimes that can really result in us clinging as tightly to a maybe more naturalistic perspective or a view
Mhm.
of the world. I personally believe that's probably a more realistic or more helpful or more useful way.
Sure.
But the clinging tightly or the needing it to feel certain,
Right.
I think in and of itself can be a source of suffering. And I think folks will often do that. And even just kind of bringing it back to the topic at hand, or what we've been talking about with religious trauma. When I first discovered religious trauma syndrome, I was a therapist at the time
Mhm.
who thought like, religion is quite harmful. And I kind of saw it that way. And then as I look back, I can see how I was still operating from this fundamentalist perspective. And I was still
Right.
kind of seeing the world in this kind of black and white way. And I was also kind of in the middle of my own healing process. And so, I think it's easy to view the world from the place, from the kind of physiological state that you're experiencing. Whereas now I can kind of look at religious trauma as, this nervous system response to events in our lives,
Right.
and we can do something about it to help people heal from that. And so I think that can be, people are at different places in their journey, and I certainly honor where they're at, of course. But I also want to continue to point out, as do you, it sounds like, that there's more to this process than just changing your beliefs. You can live a rich and full and meaningful life on the other side of religion. And your life can be such that you don't have to live it in relationship to your former beliefs. You can, like, I've moved past that. I feel safe enough. I've, maybe healed through that trauma, and I'm ready to kind of, take on new interests and do new
Right.
things in the world. And so, yeah, I think it's just important to realize that there's more to life.
Absolutely. And your practice is called Room to Thrive,
Mm-hmm.
which I just think is amazing. What I feel on this side of deconversion, on my embracing of humanism, is a thriving,
Yeah.
is a level of self-honesty, is a level of humility, uh, a deepening of relationships, even with my believing family, because I'm being vulnerable. I'm being honest with them. But thrive is just such a evocative word. And so I
Yeah.
appreciate that is how you title your work.
Yeah. And I think that really is something that I care deeply about. And, inside of trauma physiology, there's this kind of need to survive, right?
Mhm.
We can't connect with other humans in this kind of open and free way that we want to when the world is a threatening place, because now we're just focused on the escape or the threat. And when we're in that physiological state, we can't thrive. I mean, and I think that's where trauma takes that away from us, this ability to connect, this ability to, live and move in this rich
Mhm.
and free way, in this kind of, socially connected way that we want to. And I think that's where, if we can do this work of healing trauma, we can come to a place where we can thrive again. And I think that's just so important to me personally. And I'm really passionate about that piece of it. It's not enough to, point out how religion has harmed folks if we're not also stepping up and helping them heal so they can thrive again.
Right. One of the challenges that I think and to use as general a term as possible, the secular community,
Hmm.
is that last word, is community.
Hmm.
We've talked about the need for connection. We've talked about the need for human relationships, that doesn't go away. Sometimes people lose their entire social network,
Hmm.
including family, going through this process. Not to put you on the spot, but what do you recommend for people? How do they start to rebuild a community around them?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really big question, and I certainly don't have the answer.
Yeah.
I have what I think might be a few pieces of that puzzle.
Hmm.
I think, as we just talked about, if we're in this kind of trauma physiology, this kind of survival physiology, we're not equipped to connect. And I think there's kind of like layers of impact that people have when they leave the
Sure.
faith. There's this, they don't have access to that community that they once had because of the doctrinal differences or
Right.
whatever. Like, I no longer go to that same
Excommunication.
church. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
So that disappears. But then I think, what if we look at it through this kind of trauma lens, we also kind of lose this ability to connect
Mm.
if we feel that, if we've experienced trauma where any type of top-down structure is something that kind of is a trigger for me. It's something that I feel very unsafe inside of. When people gather together around a common interest, it starts to make me question their motives, and they're going to hurt me, and this isn't safe for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so not only do you lose this community that was there that may have been completely harmful and not okay for you, or may more likely was some combination of, I really valued certain friendships, but I didn't go along with the beliefs.
Right.
It's usually something like that, right? And then if we had the experience of like community harmed me or wasn't okay for me, or I felt unsafe or threatened inside of that, if we don't heal that, if we don't come to a place where I feel safe and okay connecting with other humans again, I think that we have a lot of traumatized post-religious folks who are reenacting their trauma or trying to work out their trauma inside
Mm-hmm.
of communities, and you can never be safe enough. You can never do things well enough.
Right.
Be accepting enough, whatever it is. It's this need for safety that they're trying to create, but in this way that's it's almost impossible to achieve.
Right.
And so I think there's just so much there, right? If from my perspective, and I think hopefully what I bring to the conversation is, if we can address the individual nervous system needs of folks, that will at least give them the opportunity to connect.
Right.
I think we can then do the additionally challenging work of developing community.
Right.
But if we're all kind of in this, to use a very old trauma term back before we recognize trauma, this kind of shell-shocked kind of place, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We just had this really horrific experience. And physiologically, I don't feel safe connecting to any group right now because groups hurt me and groups aren't safe. I think that's where if we're not able to address that initial need for safety, which is the work of healing trauma, is developing a sense of safety, a sense of autonomy, a sense of power,
Mm-hmm.
a sense of I can do what's necessary to protect myself inside of another group. We're going to have a lot of folks who just can't connect to a group, or groups we're only part of groups at this kind of arm's length.
Right.
And I think we've made that process even more challenging in a secular community, again, using a very broad term,
Sure.
this amorphous term, but in communities where we focus a lot on logic and reason, we've made it difficult for nervous systems to connect with each other in a way that feels safe and okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where, if we were to address some of those underlying kind of survival needs in a way that people felt safe and okay connecting again, I don't think it like magically makes community appear.
Sure.
But I think it creates a context in which community can develop. And I think that's where we can structurally try to kind of configure community. And I think, folks have tried that, and with varying degrees of success. But I think that's not enough on its own if we're not also allowing people to feel safe and connected inside of that.
Right. I just need to get on my soapbox for just a split second and I'll get right back off. But the internet, I feel like, is a bittersweet blessing and a curse in that it provides this immediate sense of community, but it's a simulacrum of community. We need the being in the same room, breathing the same air, seeing body, all of that is necessary as a part of connection with other human beings. And I feel like my encouragement to the listeners is get what you can out of the internet communities, but find people around you, even if it's just one other person to spend time with, to talk through these things, because that human interaction is just vitally important.
Yeah. And I would certainly join you on that soapbox. And I would maybe go, I don't know, it's not one step further, to maybe broaden that a bit.
Sure.
When I'm looking at this through this kind of nervous system lens, we can connect with other humans who may or may not understand what we went through inside of religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the important piece is that there's that human connection there. And so
Right.
I totally agree with you that we can come together with individuals who have had similar experiences, and I think that's going to be a very rich and full potential for a very rich and meaningful, relationship, because there's so much that's unsaid that we just kind of understand. And that's not always available in certain communities. And
that is true.
So then the art teacher, in town, or, the local coffee shop where, there's conversations happening, wherever you can find that kind of human connection. I think
Right.
that's so, so important. And then also kind of noticing, your system's response to that. This initially feels unsafe or not okay. And what do I need to feel safe and okay? I think often the work that I do with trauma is asking ourselves that question kind of moment to moment. What do I need right now to feel safe and okay?
Yeah.
Do I need to push someone away? Do I need to bring someone close? Is there like this, what do I need to have a sense of strength, autonomy, and connection? And I think when we start really focusing on that, then, that makes it easier to connect with others and also to push others away who are unsafe.
Right. Absolutely.
I think that's really important.
I really don't want to leave without talking about how we interact with the believers in our life.
Mm-hmm.
I think the most succinct number one thing that I've pulled from your work is this idea of the believers in our lives are at step 0. We've gone through what can be a very long process,
Mm-hmm.
for some people, decades.
Yeah.
My favorite analogy is the idea of a phase change. There's all these things happening under the surface as
Mm-hmm.
water goes to ice or into a gas the other direction. For deconversion, there's the little tiny things that bump us one direction or the other until some people experience what feels like an instantaneous change of mind. Others, it's a longer process, even then still. The point is that after we've kind of admitted to ourselves that we no longer believe, we've felt some emotion, we've vented, we've gotten angry, we've gone through this wide range of experiences, including information gathering and refining our ideas. And then we go to talk to somebody who is still a believer, who maybe we love very much,
Mm-hmm.
and they are at step 0, and we just unload on them with all the pent up emotion and energy and all the hammer of this new rationality and this new knowledge. Anyway, I just feel like remembering, slowing down, stopping, and recognizing that person has not gone through the process that we have gone through is critically important.
Yeah. I think, in that example, it could be even something even more subtle than that. Even if you're not kind of unloading on them and like, oh, this is where I'm at now, and this is what I believe, and this is why my old beliefs were wrong. Even if it's not that kind of forceful, even if you just say, hey, you know what, I don't believe this anymore, or I'm having serious doubts. And you've spent the last 6 months or 3 years kind of going through these doubts and figuring out like, this is why I'm at where I'm at. And they're just starting from 1, like you said. You're at step 15 and they're just starting at step 1. And I think that lag can create a fair amount of misunderstanding and tension there. And so there's no kind of right way to go through this process. And there's maybe some risk involved in involving friends and family early on and letting them kind of like go through some of the stages with you. But then there's also kind of risk involved if you go it alone and then one day say, hey, this is where I'm at now. And they're like, whoa, like, it's like too fast. I'm not ready yet for that. And so, I think understanding that and why that can be challenging, maybe there's a way to be more, kind of intentional and thoughtful about how one goes about disclosing that information to give their believing friends and family a chance to kind of get caught up to speed. And I think that's also, it's worth pointing out that you don't owe anyone an explanation.
Totally agree.
For why you believe, but then also if these are relationships that you want to maintain at some level, those conversations, may be important. And you get to be in charge and in control of how much information you disclose, which I think from a trauma perspective as well is so important to be like, I'm in charge of this process. I'm saying what I want to say, when I want to say it, to whom I want to say it. Is like so important in recognizing that. Because oftentimes, I'm sorry, I'm totally a trauma geek. So
no problem. That's why you're here.
If you've been in a freeze collapse state because of trauma inside of a religious context, we want to be safe and social. And so the way the nervous system is organized in this kind of dorsal vagal, this freeze collapse place, is like the first nervous system to evolve for mammals. And that's that kind of just survival at all costs, freeze collapse, feign death. That's that kind of place, a very dark and lonely place. And then the next system to evolve is this kind of fight or flight. This is,
Yeah.
Fleeing to safety or fighting to maintain your autonomy. And then the next nervous system piece of the nervous system is actually a branch of the dorsal vagal of the freeze collapse. And that's that kind of safe and social.
Mm-hmm.
It's what allows humans to be in the same room with each other without detecting threat or, being on edge. It's like we start detecting physical cues about this other human that allows us to kind of put the brake on. It's kind of this nervous system brake saying, you don't have to run away.
Yeah.
You don't have to fight this person. They're safe enough. And that's a really beautiful place of connection. It's also where intimacy lives. In freeze collapse, there's this being paralyzed in fear, but in this kind of ventral vagal place, this kind of more socially connected place, there's being paralyzed or immobilized,
Mm-hmm.
but in this sense of intimacy and connection. And so it's this really amazing place. And so back to the dorsal vagal, this kind of freeze collapse place, oftentimes trauma survivors will only kind of get out of that state in this kind of burst of energy, right? There's this like,
Right.
I'm so angry. And then they feel this power and strength that they don't feel in the dorsal vagal. And they get into this kind of activated fight place.
Right.
Or flee place. And what I want to point out is that it's so important to have that experience from a trauma perspective. And I think anger has been stigmatized and,
Okay.
you're being emotional or out of control. And I think from my perspective, any way you can get out of this freeze collapse place is probably helpful.
Okay.
Now we can do it more intentionally. We can do it in a more controlled way where I am angry, this kind of healthy aggression, and I'm going to like speak forcefully and powerfully and do what needs to be done. But I recognize that even if a person kind of burst out of that place in this kind of like blaze of glory, tell people how it is and burn bridges and whatever, there's at least the potential now in the activated state to do something to change your level of safety, right? I think the important thing to remember is that you can't go from freeze collapse to safe and social without going through the activated state.
Interesting.
And so we think about how we've socialized kids to defer to authority, how we've socialized women and minorities to, you need to be polite and do what's asked, and then you get to survive. That's oftentimes a very frozen and collapsed place, pleasing, appeasing.
Okay.
And there needs to be this healthy sense of aggression to thrive as humans, to have this vital life force, like I will do what's necessary to survive. That doing that work in that kind of activated place allows you to develop enough safety around you, enough sense of your own power in order for you to feel safe and connected. I think so often we get stuck in this freeze collapse place because we're uncomfortable pushing back forcefully and doing what's necessary to protect ourselves. And so I want your listeners to know that it's perfectly okay to be angry, and it's let's harness that in a way that can shift and change how you physically feel in the world, that you feel that strength and power, and not in this kind of out of control or dangerous way. Because another pattern that's quite common with trauma survivors is going from freeze collapse to this kind of like being really angry in this kind of out of control way. And then that feels threatening and scary, or at least unfamiliar. And then they go back to freeze collapse because at least they get to survive there. And we want people to be in this kind of activated state, but in a way that they feel safe enough so they can continue to move up the ladder to a place of safe and social.
Absolutely. And the only thing I want to highlight is in the moment, in those early stages where the anger is very imminent and present, there may be relationships that with hindsight later down the road, we would want to keep. And there's a tendency to just burn the bridge behind us.
Yeah.
Or to hide entirely. I have had people on the podcast who say, they didn't tell their spouse for 10 years, 5 years, something for a very long time.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that both of those ends of the spectrum aren't as helpful.
Yeah.
I just want to highlight, I agree entirely. If your safety is involved, if there's abuse, emotional or physical or spiritual involved, getting distance, being angry, those are very, very healthy first responses.
Yeah, for sure. And I think to speak to your point as well, if we're in this kind of freeze collapse place where maybe we're hiding or we're not saying what needs to be said, often that's associated with this underlying sense of powerlessness, right? It's hard to
Right.
connect. Now, the friends and family who I want to connect with, they're a threat to my system. It
Mm-hmm.
feels even more unsafe. Like I'm cringing that they're going to ask me about my beliefs, or they're going to ask
Right.
me to pray or something. There's just like, this doesn't feel safe or okay. And so I think when you're saying we want to maybe maintain those relationships in the future, I totally agree. And here's what I
Yeah.
want to point out as well, is that having a rupture in that relationship or that connection isn't the end.
Right.
In some ways, if I push back forcefully in a relationship where I felt powerless, that's going to take the other person's nervous system by surprise. It's going to maybe create some challenges for them. But if at the end of that, I feel a bit safer inside of that
Mm-hmm.
relationship, now I can come back and say, hey, it maybe came across that I was overreacting, and I said things maybe more forcefully than was necessary. But I want you to know that this is important to me, that I still believe very strongly that you don't get to tell me what to believe,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or whatever it is.
Right.
And I think then that allows you to repair that. If you're in freeze collapse, there's no chance of repairing that. There's no chance of making that relationship work, because there's not enough safety to connect with another human in that state. And so
Right.
I think I totally agree. I think sometimes what happens is we, like you said, just burn it all to the ground.
Right. Yes.
But then that also can be a place where we feel stuck as well, because now that feels like I can't trust my power, because
Mm-hmm.
when I interact with other humans, it's just all or nothing. And that also feels very unsafe. And so we want a person to have a strong connection with their own strength and power, and being able to do something to feel safe and okay again. And then from that place to continue moving towards connection,
Right.
and so that's where that repairing those relationships may be important for the individual, or connecting with other humans when you feel safe enough.
Right.
Yeah.
So another element of the podcast has been to encourage people to seek counselors, to seek
Mhm.
out professional help going through these traumatic experiences. I understand you are a licensed clinical social worker in
Mhm.
Idaho, but that you also do some coaching beyond that. If somebody wanted to engage with your services, how would they do so?
Yeah. So I think finding me on my website, roomtothrive.com, also on Facebook and Instagram, and now Twitter. And those are all at Room to Thrive. Is a great way to reach out to me, or connect with me. Like you said, I can do a more clinically focused work within the state of Idaho. I do telehealth inside of Idaho, and I do coaching across the globe with folks. But it's trauma informed, but we're not doing clinical work,
Okay.
because of ethics, and because of
Yeah.
and
Rules.
my desire for safety
Yeah.
for clients as well. And so
Yeah.
you can find there are some folks out there who are unlicensed, providing consultation and stuff online, and also claiming to do therapy type work online. And there are a lot of kind of risk factors involved with that. And so I would caution you against that. I have helped a lot of folks find a local clinician in their area.
Mhm. Okay.
And I'm really excited about this group of therapists that I'm connected with and collaborating with. As part of that group, we're developing some training for therapists around religious trauma, so they can be more informed.
Mhm.
And then also kind of a database where folks can find local clinicians. Our goal is to have at least one online therapist in each state. And then internationally, there's the way the laws and rules work. It varies from country to country, but
Okay.
there's a lot more flexibility kind of working internationally as well. So so that's some exciting stuff happening.
Well, fantastic. I really encourage people to take a look at Room to Thrive and engage Brian. Brian, thank you so much for being on the podcast and giving your time.
Oh, you bet. Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it. It was really, really great chatting with you.
Final thoughts on the episode. Well, as you could hear, Brian is a very important voice in the deconversion world. He was kind enough to give me some time a year and a half or so ago and let me vent a bit about wanting to participate in some way or another. Ultimately, some of that encouragement has led to me running this podcast myself. For that, I want to thank Brian, and I appreciate his perspective and voice in this space. Again, as I said in the intro, you could hear me learning in real time The expansiveness of Brian's concern and compassion for people who have experienced religious trauma and adverse religious experiences is amazing. And it expanded my perspective as well on caring and helping people walk through the deconversion process. I very much appreciated Brian's science-based, evidence-based, evolutionary perspective on the body's experience, the whole person's experience of trauma. I think that is well-informed and something that can be very helpful for us as we experience the response, our body's response to these potentially traumatic events. In particular, I thought it was important that Brian really pushed back on me about the importance of an angry phase, and that anger can be the impetus to get out. I, again, did not have that perspective before going into this conversation, and I think it's an important one. We've also tried to minimize and squelch the anger of, in particular, women and people who are leaving the church. And so Brian was able to get me to understand the importance of that anger. That is a way to experience power and self-empowerment and be able to get out from underneath the religious abuse. To quote him directly, he says, "You can't go from the freeze collapse to safe and social without going through the activated state." The other thing that I seem to have just really learned in real time was I've often talked about the need to not burn bridges on your way out as you go through the deconversion process and let your anger destroy relationships. But Brian very correctly points out that that is not the end of a relationship. It's possible that you may have had an argument or have burned some bridges, but that doesn't mean that those relationships are entirely dead. You can always recover those. And again, I learned from Brian in this discussion, and I think he is correct. And then lastly, on a personal note, I love the way he talked about community. He points out that as human beings, we need community to survive. And he phrases it in the safe and social perspective of the trauma experience. And I have to admit that I relate a lot to my previous guest, Alice Gretchen, who talked about just being skeptical or uninterested in being a part of a group. I find that I definitely can be in that category personally. And again, I feel that I learned from Brian's conversation today of the need to reach out and to be more active and proactive in my community participation. I want to thank Brian for being on the podcast and sharing his expertise and wisdom. If you are interested in reaching out to Brian either as a therapist or a coach, you can reach him at roomtothrive.com. I will have links in the show notes for all of his resources. I highly encourage you get in touch with him, or a secular therapist in your area. There are resources available to find a therapist in your area as well. I'll tease again that I have a number of interviews done that will be coming out in the next few months. I'm excited about those interviews, and I'm excited to share them with you. Keep listening in. I've got lots of different things to share with you that I think you're going to enjoy. Until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Time for some footnotes. The song is a track called Waves by Makaih Beats. Please check out her music. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to help support the podcast, here are the ways you can go about that. First, help promote it. The podcast's audience grows by word of mouth. If you found it useful or just entertaining, please pass it on to your friends and family. Post about it on social media so that others can find it. Please rate and review the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. This will help raise the visibility of our show. Join me on the podcast. Tell your story. Have you gone through a faith transition? You want to tell that to the world? Let me know and let's have you on. Do you know someone who needs to tell their story? Let them know. Do you have criticisms about atheism or humanism, but you're willing to have an honesty contest with me? Come on the show. If you have a book or a blog that you want to promote, I'd like to hear from you. Also, you can contribute technical support. If you are good at graphic design, sound engineering, or marketing, please let me know and I'll let you know how you can participate. And finally, financial support. There will be a link on the show notes to allow contributions which would help defray the cost of producing the show. If you want to get in touch with me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, or you can send email to gracefulatheist@gmail.com. You can tweet at me at gracefulatheist, or you can just check out my website at gracefulatheist.wordpress.com. Get in touch and let me know if you appreciate the podcast. Well, this has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Grab somebody you love and tell them how much they mean to you. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.